Warren Buffett just parked $382 billion in cash. The world's smartest investor isn't buying anything. While markets hit all-time highs, the Oracle of Omaha sits on the sidelines with the largest cash pile in Berkshire Hathaway's history. That's not caution. That's a signal. Something is fundamentally broken in the global economic system. And most people have no idea they're living inside the machine that's about to fail. Let me show you what's really happening. The numbers sound impossible at first. America owes $38 trillion. China, $18 trillion. Japan's debt exceeds 230% of everything their economy produces in a year. These aren't small countries with weak economies. These are the pillars of global finance. So here's the question that keeps economists awake at night. If everyone is drowning in debt, who exactly is doing the lending? Think about it. When you borrow money from a bank, that money exists somewhere. The bank got it from depositors, from investors, from capital markets. There's a source, there's a lender and a borrower. Simple. But when we scale this up to nations, something very strange happens. The mathematics stop making sense. Let me walk you through the reality, because once you understand how this system actually works, you'll never look at money the same way again. Start with the United States. $38 trillion in federal debt. That's so large that if you spent $1 million every single day, it would take you over 100,000 years to spend that much. Who holds this debt? Who are these mysterious lenders? The first answer surprises most people. Americans themselves. The Federal Reserve, America's central bank, owns roughly $6.7 trillion of Treasury securities. Let that sink in. The American government owes money to the American government's bank. But it gets stranger. Another $7 trillion sits in what's called intragovernmental holdings, the government owing money to itself. Social Security owns $2.8 trillion of U.S. debt. The Military Retirement Fund owns another $1.6 trillion. Medicare holds a massive chunk, so the government borrows from Social Security to fund other programs. Promises to pay it back later. It's like borrowing from your left pocket to pay your right pocket. We're already at $13 trillion that America essentially owes to itself. That's more than a third of the total debt. The question, who's the lender, becomes strange, doesn't it? But let's continue. Private American investors hold roughly $24 trillion through mutual funds, pension funds, insurance companies, banks. Where did these institutions get their money? From ordinary Americans, from workers saving for retirement, from families building their future. Here's where it gets fascinating. Imagine a teacher in California. She's 55, been teaching for 30 years. Every month, part of her salary goes into her pension fund. That fund needs somewhere safe to invest, somewhere that will reliably pay returns so she can retire comfortably. What's safer than lending to the United States government? So her pension fund buys treasury bonds. That same teacher worries about the national debt. She sees the frightening numbers on the news. She's concerned, and she's right to be. But here's the twist. She is one of the lenders. Her retirement depends on the government continuing to borrow money and paying interest on those bonds. If America suddenly paid off all its debt tomorrow, her pension fund would lose one of its safest, most reliable investments. This is the first secret of government debt. Citizens are simultaneously the borrowers, benefiting from government spending, and the lenders, their savings invested in government bonds. Then there's foreign investors, about $8.5 trillion of U.S. debt, roughly 30% of the publicly held portion. China owns about $760 billion. Japan owns $1.1 trillion. But why do other countries buy American debt? Japan exports cars, electronics, machinery to the United States. Americans buy these products with dollars. Japanese companies earn those dollars. They need to convert them to yen to pay workers back home. But if they all exchange their dollars at once, the yen would strengthen dramatically. Japanese exports would become expensive, less competitive. So what does Japan do? The Bank of Japan buys those dollars and invests them in U.S. Treasury securities. It's a way to recycle trade imbalances. America buys physical goods from Japan. Sony televisions, Toyota cars. Japan takes those dollars and buys American financial assets, Treasury bonds. The money flows in a circle. The debt is just the accounting record of that circular flow. China operates the same way. For years, they deliberately kept their currency weak to boost exports. They accumulated massive dollar reserves. What do you do with $3 trillion? You can't stuff it under a mattress. The U.S. Treasury market is one of the few places deep enough and liquid enough to absorb that much money. So they buy Treasury bonds. Here's the crucial point. For much of the world, U.S. government debt isn't a burden being forced on unwilling lenders. It's an asset they want to own. Treasury bonds are considered the safest financial asset in the world. When uncertainty strikes, war, pandemic, financial crisis, money floods into U.S. treasuries. It's called flight to safety. But America isn't alone in this. Global public debt now stands at $311 trillion. That's 331% of the entire world's economic output. The US and China together account for more than half of all government debt in the world. Japan presents the most extreme case. Japanese government debt is 230% of GDP. If Japan were a person earning £50,000 a year, they'd owe £115,000. Bankruptcy territory. And yet Japan continues to function. Interest rates on Japanese government bonds are close to zero, sometimes even negative. Why? Because Japanese citizens buy the bonds. Japan's debt is almost entirely held domestically. Japanese banks, pension funds, insurance companies, households own 90% of Japanese government debt. Think about that. Japanese people are famous for saving. They diligently put money away. But where does that money go? Into government bonds, the safest place to store wealth. And what does the government do with that borrowed money? Spends it on schools, hospitals, infrastructure, pensions, benefiting those same citizens. It's a closed loop. Now we come to the mechanism that really explains how this entire system works. Quantitative easing, sometimes called QE. Here's what it actually is. Central banks create money out of thin air, literally create it digitally with keystrokes, and use that newly created money to buy government bonds. The Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan don't have to find money somewhere to lend to their governments. They create it. During the 2008 to 2009 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve created about $3.5 trillion this way. During COVID, they created another $4 trillion. The money didn't come from anywhere. It was simply created. Now, before you think this is fraud, let me explain why central banks do this. During a crisis, the economy seizes up. People stop spending because they're afraid. Businesses stop investing because there's no demand. Banks stop lending because they're worried about defaults. This creates a vicious cycle. Less spending means less income means less spending. The government needs to step in, build hospitals, send stimulus checks, save failing banks, whatever the emergency requires. But the government needs to borrow enormous amounts to do this. In normal times, there might not be enough willing lenders at reasonable interest rates, so the central bank steps in, creates money, buys government bonds, keeps interest rates low, ensures the government can borrow what it needs. The theory is that this newly created money will flow into the economy, encourage lending and spending, help end the recession. Once the economy recovers, the central bank can reverse the process, sell those bonds back into the market, destroy the money, bring things back to normal. That's the theory. Reality is more complicated. The first round of quantitative easing after the financial crisis seemed to work reasonably well. It prevented complete economic collapse. But here's what else happened. Asset prices exploded, stock markets soared, real estate prices jumped. Why? Because all that newly created money ended up in the hands of banks and financial institutions. They didn't necessarily lend it out to small businesses or home buyers. Instead, they bought stocks, bonds, property. The wealthy, who own most financial assets, got much wealthier. Research by the Bank of England estimated that quantitative easing boosted stock and bond prices by about 20%. Sounds good until you realize that 40% of the stock market is owned by the wealthiest 5% of the population. The richest 5% of British households became about £128,000 wealthier on average. Meanwhile, families who owned little to no financial assets saw minimal benefit. This is one of the great ironies of modern economic policy. We create money to save the economy, but that money disproportionately benefits those who are already wealthy. The system works, but it exacerbates inequality. Now let's talk about the cost of all this debt. Debt isn't free. It accumulates interest. The United States paid $1 trillion in interest in fiscal year 2025, just in interest payments. That's more than the country spends on its entire military. It's the second largest item in the federal budget, behind only Social Security. And that number is rising fast. Interest payments nearly tripled over 3 years, from $497 billion in 2022 to $999 billion in 2024. By 2035, interest payments are projected to reach $1.8 trillion per year. Over the next decade, the U.S. government will spend $13.8 trillion just on interest. Not on schools, not on roads, not on healthcare or defense, just on interest. Think about what that means. Every dollar paid in interest is money that cannot be spent on anything else. It's not building infrastructure, it's not funding research, it's not helping the poor. It's just paying interest to bondholders. And here's the cruel mathematics. As debt grows, interest payments grow. As interest payments grow, deficits grow. As deficits grow, more borrowing is needed. As more borrowing happens, debt grows. It's a feedback loop. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2034, interest costs will consume roughly 4% of America's entire economic output. They'll account for 22% of all federal revenues. More than one in every $5 collected in taxes will go purely to interest payments. But America isn't alone. Across the OECD, the club of wealthy nations, interest payments now average 3.3% of GDP. That's more than these governments collectively spend on defense. More than 3.4 billion people worldwide live in countries where interest payments on government debt exceed what those governments spend on either education or healthcare. Think about that. There are countries where the government pays more to bondholders than it spends on teaching children or treating the sick. For developing nations, the situation is even more dire. Poor countries paid a record $96 billion to service their external debt in 2023. Their interest costs hit $34.6 billion, 4 times what they paid a decade ago. Some countries are paying 38% of their export earnings just on interest. That's money that could modernize their economies, build infrastructure, educate their populations. Instead, it flows out as interest payments to foreign creditors. 61 developing countries now allocate 10% or more of government revenues to interest payments. Many are trapped. They pay more to service existing debt than they receive in new loans. It's like drowning while making payments on a mortgage as your house sinks into the sea. So why don't countries just default, just refuse to pay? It happens, of course. Argentina has defaulted 9 times in its history. Russia defaulted in 1998. Greece nearly defaulted in 2010. But default is catastrophic. It means being shut out of global credit markets. Your currency collapses. Imports become unaffordable. Pensioners lose their savings. No government chooses default unless there's absolutely no alternative. And for major economies, the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, the European powers, default is unthinkable. These countries borrow in their own currencies. They can always print more money to make payments. The constraint isn't ability to pay, it's inflation. Print too much money and the currency loses value. That's its own kind of disaster. So what's sustaining this system? Why does it keep working? First reason, demographics, and savings. Wealthy countries have aging populations. People are living longer. They need safe places to store wealth for retirement. Government bonds serve that function. As long as people need safe assets, there will be demand for government debt. Second reason, the structure of the global economy. We live in a world of massive trade imbalances. Some countries run huge surpluses. They export far more than they import. Others run huge deficits. Those surplus countries accumulate financial claims on deficit countries, often in the form of government bonds. As long as these imbalances persist, so will the debt. Third reason, monetary policy itself. Central banks use government bonds as tools. They buy bonds to inject money into the economy. They sell bonds to withdraw money. Government debt is the lubricant of monetary policy. Central banks need a large supply of government bonds to function. Fourth reason, and this is subtle, in a modern economy, safe assets are valuable precisely because they're scarce. In a world of risk, safety has a premium. Government bonds of stable countries offer that safety. If governments actually paid down their debt, there would be a shortage of safe assets. Pension funds, insurance companies, banks would struggle to find places to safely invest. Paradoxically, the world needs government debt. But here's what keeps me awake at night. This system is stable until it isn't. Throughout history, debt crises happen when confidence evaporates, when lenders suddenly decide they don't trust the borrower anymore. This happened to Greece in 2010. It happened to numerous Latin American countries in the 1980s, Asian countries in 1997. The pattern is always the same. Debt builds up gradually over years. Everything seems fine. Then suddenly, triggered by some event, some loss of confidence, investors panic. They demand higher interest rates. Governments can't pay. Crisis erupts. Could this happen to a major economy? To the United States or China or Japan? Conventional wisdom says no. These countries control their own currencies. They have deep financial markets. They're too big to fail at a global level. But conventional wisdom has been wrong before. In 2007, experts said housing prices couldn't fall nationwide. They did. In 2010, experts said the euro was unbreakable. It nearly broke. In 2019, nobody predicted a global pandemic would shut down the world economy for 2 years. The risks are accumulating. Global debt is at levels never seen in peacetime. Interest rates, after years near zero, have risen sharply. That makes servicing debt more expensive. Political polarization is increasing in many countries, making coherent fiscal policy harder. Climate change will require massive investments. Investments that must somehow be financed amid already historic debt levels. Aging populations mean fewer workers supporting more retirees, straining government budgets. And then there's the question of trust. The entire system depends on confidence. Confidence that governments will make payments. Confidence that currencies will hold value. Confidence that inflation will remain moderate. If that confidence breaks, the system breaks. So to return to our original question, every nation is in debt. Who's the lender? The answer is we are, all of us, through our pension funds and our banks, through our insurance policies and our savings accounts, through our government's central banks creating money, through trade imbalances that recycle into bond purchases. We collectively lend to ourselves. The debt is claims that different parts of the global economy have on other parts. It's a vast, interconnected web of obligations. This system has enabled enormous prosperity. It's financed infrastructure, research, education, healthcare. It's allowed governments to respond to crises without being constrained by tax revenues alone. It's created financial assets that support retirement and provide stability. But it's also unstable, especially as debt levels climb to unprecedented heights. We're in uncharted territory. Never before in peacetime have governments borrowed so much. Never before have interest payments consumed such large portions of budgets. The question isn't whether this system can continue indefinitely. It can't. Nothing in economics continues indefinitely. The question is how it adjusts. Will the adjustment be gradual? Governments slowly bringing deficits under control, economies growing faster than debt accumulates? Or will it be sudden? a crisis that forces painful changes all at once. Warren Buffett has a favorite market indicator, the total market capitalization of all stocks divided by GDP. He said that when this ratio approaches 200%, you're playing with fire. Right now it's at 210%, the highest it's ever been in recorded history. Buffett is sitting on $382 billion in cash. He's been a net seller of stocks for 12 consecutive quarters. He stopped buying back Berkshire's own stock when the world's most successful investor with a 60-year track record is hoarding cash at record levels and refusing to buy stocks. That tells you something about current valuations. I don't have a crystal ball. Nobody does. But I can tell you this. The longer debt grows, the narrower the path becomes between those two possibilities. The margin for error shrinks. We've built a global economy where everyone owes everyone else, where money is created by central banks to buy government bonds, where today's spending is paid for by tomorrow's taxpayers, where the wealthy benefit disproportionately from policies meant to help everyone, where poor countries pay crippling interest to rich country creditors. This isn't sustainable forever. Something we'll have to give. The only question is what and when, and whether we'll manage the transition intelligently or let it manage us. The riddle of who's lending when everyone's in debt isn't really a riddle at all. It's a mirror. When we ask who's the lender, we're really asking who's in charge of the system and where is it taking us. The uncomfortable truth is nobody's really in charge. The system has its own logic, its own momentum. We've built something complex and powerful and fragile, and we're all along for the ride.